Tourists are struck by both the beauty and cheerful friendliness of Poland. We are in the iconic center of Krakow, this amazing medieval capital of Poland. There are tourists everywhere, for good reason. But a few days ago, I actually saw a woman stop her car to avoid ruining someone's photograph. It's a feel-good city. Yet the darkness and horror of what happened here simply can't be ignored, even if it seems so out of place. I'm walking in the site of the old slave labor camp of Krakow, the one made famous in the film Schindler's List. This building, the one behind me, is the actual building that the camp commander would randomly shoot at prisoners from. Monuments to mass murder are everywhere. Notorious concentration camps litter the region. Was it just random bad luck for Poland? Actually, there's a reason Poland was ground zero for the Holocaust, and a reason that is not widely known outside Poland, and a fascinating story begging to be told. Every country has a unique story, and Poland is no different. The piece of land that Poland lies on is mostly flat, with few physical barriers, uniquely easy for immigrants and invaders alike to wander through. And wander through they did. The earliest populations we know of were a mix of Baltic peoples, Celts, and Finno-Ugric tribes. Around the 6th century, Germanic and Slavic tribes began wandering in, as did Vikings and much later invaders like Genghis Khan and the Huns. But it wasn't just farmers looking for land and invaders looking to pillage. Poland was in the middle of several useful trade routes between the Black Sea and the Baltics called the Amber Road. With trade that started sometime before the 10th century CE came traders and immigrants. When the early Jewish immigrants started coming in due to religious persecution in Western Europe, they actually already found Jews already here, but one speaking a Slavic Jewish dialect called Canonic, long since extinct. In fact, when the first king of Poland gave up paganism in order to join the Christians, he may not have been the first. There was probably already a local Armenian Christian community living here. Invaders were such an ever-present problem that they built their churches as fortresses. This church, the St. Andrew in Krakow, is one of the few surviving fortress churches, but it served its purpose. During the Hun invasion of 1241, the entire population of Krakow was massacred, except for those that barricaded themselves in this church. You can see the slit windows for shooting arrows out of, just like a castle. The Hun invasion did more than demonstrate the value of fortress churches. They left the land depopulated and defenseless. When the Huns began withdrawing, probably because of the death of their king, both the Lithuanians and Poles had competent rulers which rapidly filled in the void, adding a lot of land and a large number of Eastern Slavs like Belarusians, Russians, and Ukrainians into their already diverse populations. The end result was a Poland and Lithuania that looked like this. I'm bringing Lithuania into the picture because the two countries ended up merging into a federation. When they did merge, they constituted the biggest country in Europe at the time. As weird as two different countries merging sounds now, at the time both of them were big multinational states. In fact, ethnic Lithuanians only composed a little over 10% of Lithuania's population. For that matter, Poland, though it started with the Polish dynasty, went 400 years without an ethnic Pole for a king. They had Lithuanian, Swedish, French, whatever for their rulers. Also, Poland and Lithuania had already shared the same king for almost 200 years before they finally officially merged. Now, when the two countries merged in 1569, it formed what we call the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in English. But the Polish is a little more interesting. I really shouldn't even try to pronounce it, but here goes. Rzeczpospolita Obojga Narodów literally means the Republic of Both Nations. This massive country was one of the world's great republics. And I'm not using the term lightly. Religious liberty was guaranteed. A bicameral Congress, called the Sejm, which is right behind me, was a constant worry for the king. He not only could not declare war without Congress, but even if they agreed to war, he then had to beg them to finance the thing. The king didn't decide who his successor would be. When the king died, the parliament, or Sejm, met and voted in the next king. The king really was a president, though granted it was a lifetime term. The citizens of Poland and Lithuania had what they called their golden liberties, and they would not give them up easily. When historians look at it now, they are really struck by how democratic it all was. The interesting thing is that when contemporaries looked at it, they had a very different impression. They were shocked at the religious liberty thing. An amusing little meme was running the circuit in 16th century Europe. Someone described England as the paradise of women, the hell of horses, and the purgatory of servants, and it took off. Apparently there were variants for Italy and France, and eventually one surfaced for the Republic of Poland-Lithuania. Heaven for the nobility, purgatory for townspeople, hell for peasants, paradise for the Jews. In fact, no one knows if Paradise for the Jews was praise or criticism of Poland. They don't even know who wrote it, but once written, it took off. Paweł Wojtkowicz, a Polish legal scholar, went to the Council of Constance in 1414 and made a passionate speech arguing against the practice of forced conversions of pagans by the sword in 1414. Here's the thing, long before the United States was established in the Americas, there was already an immigrant magnet, a country that wanted your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, and most importantly, welcomed your religious minorities, your Jews, your heretics. That country was the Polish-Lithuanian Republic, and Poland got them. Lutherans from Catholic countries, Catholics from Lutheran countries, Valdensians, Moravians, Moravian Brethren, Hussites, the list goes on. And also people that believe the Copernican theory of the Earth going around the sun. Copernicus, he actually studied here at the Jagiellonian University of Krakow. Do I exaggerate when I compare Poland and Lithuania with the US? Not really. Poland and Lithuania was nowhere like a modern democratic state, but neither was the US when it was founded in 1776. In Poland, around 10% of the population could vote, but in the US, it was only about double that. And remember that bit about hell for peasants? Well, when the US was founded, it had slaves and was busy importing more. Poland had serfs. At first, they were treated quite well and had a lot of rights, even if they were poor, but that would change. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or the Republic of Both Nations, was a remarkable power. It was also fabulously wealthy. It not only was a breadbasket of Europe, keeping Europe fed, and a major trade route, but it also leveraged the labor and creativity of all the religious minorities of Europe. I just ordered a little drink that was invented in Gdansk, Poland, in its golden days in the 16th century. It is an herbal liquor with gold flakes floating in it. The wealth Poland generated was on full display for those that she made rich. Poland-Lithuania in the 16th century was powerful and fabulously wealthy and in control of its destiny. It seemed nothing could go wrong. In fact, everything went wrong. And the way it went wrong was one of the classic ways in which republics fail. The government was captured by one minority interest group completely and irrevocably. The republic had one dominant group that controlled the Senate, the upper chamber of Congress, which also held most of the wealth of the country. They were the robber barons, to use an American term, of Poland. They had three main concerns. The first was to make sure the rights of their serfs were eroded as much as possible. The second was to make sure the king was never powerful enough to take away their power and rights. The third was to make sure their taxes were as low as possible. It was easy for them to sway the lower house of parliament through bribery and patronage, so they succeeded on all counts. The serfs were soon reduced to slaves, and as slaves they had nothing left to lose. They were also quick to join any revolution. The ruler was always kept as weak as possible. He was a compromise candidate, usually a foreigner, and generally did not have Poland's best interests at heart. And they cut taxes, so that Poland's military had to be done on the cheap. Up to this time, kings raised armies when they went to war, and the army dissolved when the war was over. But just when Poland was going cheap, the rest of Europe was discovering the value of standing armies and lavishing resources on them. A revolting population, a distracted king, and a threadbare army left Poland with all her accumulated wealth a sitting duck. Invasion after invasion swept through the country as poorer but more militaristic countries invaded in order to pillage the wealth. By the 1700s, Poland was so weak that foreign countries would compete over infiltrating parliament and choosing the next ruler. Russia was particularly effective at it and had actually had soldiers at the same to make sure the vote happened the way they wanted it to. By 1795, Poland had, in a series of 3 votes over a couple decades, voted to be annexed by its neighbors and no longer existed. Obviously, the voting wasn't done voluntarily and was done at the point of the bayonet, but the tragedy of Poland was that the weakness that made that bayonet possible was popularly voted in as a tax reduction reform. So the largest country in Europe just 200 years earlier disappeared completely from the map, as completely as the lost civilization of Atlantis. But the people remained. Cities and towns were an ethnically and religiously complex tapestry like it had always been. And it wasn't just the cities. One farming village would be half German, the next 70% Jewish, the next one perhaps would be a third Polish, a third Jewish, and a third Ukrainian and Russian. It was already the type of society that the Nazis would just as soon burn to the ground. But there was one more big change that would add a little more friction. Feudalism was finally abolished in the 19th century. Poland was now occupied by Austria, Prussia, and Russia, and was no longer particularly liberal nor a heaven for Jews. But the patchwork remained, and the religious minorities were only starting to look at the US as a better alternative. The abolishment of feudalism was an earthquake in social terms. Serfs had been a majority of the population and may still have been so in 1861 when the last country, Russia, finally abolished feudalism. It helps to understand that under the laws during feudalism, different ethnic and social groups were permitted specific work. It is common knowledge that the Jews served as moneylenders, but in different areas they were permitted to work as bakers, beer brewers, or to work in mills. And they also were typically permitted to work in trade and very often worked as managers of different businesses or estates. Other immigrant groups like Germans, Scots, Dutch, Islamic Tatars, and Armenians also had specific trades they were permitted. Typically, a region or city would have very strict rules, and permitting an ethnic group a specific work monopoly was considered a favor that would encourage immigration. And the overlapping of permissions, though inevitable, was kept to a minimum. So when feudalism was abolished, many serfs headed for the towns looking for better opportunities, only to find that other ethnic groups had beat them to it. The competition in a society going through dramatic economic changes was intense. And that's why Poland was ground zero for the Holocaust. That's why the horror was worse here than anywhere else. Not only did a Nazi movement with an ideology of racial purity invade a cultural soup, not only was it an alien ideology horrifically incompatible with Poland, but it arrived at a period of time when Poland had become uncomfortable with itself. Where hundreds of years of religious propaganda had largely failed, basic economics had succeeded in causing severe social divisions. The bloodletting lasted years. The Nazis were doing almost all the killing themselves, but they were also quick to encourage and leverage whatever friction there was in society. And in a time of fear, horror, and hunger, it didn't take much. A successful, diverse, and largely harmonious society was brutalized and manipulated to brutalize their neighbors. It's such a shame. Poland is still a fascinating country, but I can't help feeling a sense of loss. What an amazing country it would have been had it been still that old, complex tapestry of peoples, cultures, and religions. And what a shame that what had been an advanced society was subject to such a retrograde, backward-looking ideology. But perhaps it has lessons for us now. I'm going to wax philosophical a bit. The way Russia acts in Ukraine and the way China acts in Xinjiang seem retrograde, more like the 1500s rather than the 21st century. As advanced societies, we can't let our guards down, but also we can't let our systems be captured by narrow interest groups the way they did in Poland. As an American, that seems to be a real risk. Even our Supreme Court seems to think that more money, not less, should be in our politics. If Poland could have reformed and taken the monopoly of power away from the robber barons, history would have been completely different. Probably World War II would have never happened. Perhaps the real lesson here is that advanced countries must remain dynamic and must be able to address challenges effectively as they arise, or they risk being overrun by retrograde neighbors. At this time in history, that would be a timely and sobering message.